welcome to the 39th Hayley-Roxanna Crafts quick cross stitch video, where I share information, hints and tips on one area of cross stitch in a short video. In this video I'm focusing on gridding Aida fabric. I mentioned gridding briefly in my video on tips for counting in cross stitch, but I thought it was a topic that deserved a video in its own right. Gridding is a technique mostly used on large cross-stitch projects to help the stitcher with counting and sizing, although it can be used on smaller projects too. You may have seen progress photos and videos of someone's cross-stitch project where the fabric is covered in small squares. That's gridding. The main reason for using gridding is to help with counting. Most patterns have a thicker line to indicate every 10 squares. So replicating these thicker lines on the fabric you are going to be stitching on can make it easier to see where you need to put the stitches. It can also be useful if you are going to be stitching cross country, which is where you stitch all the stitches of one colour regardless of where they are in the design before moving to the next colour, as it will be easier to move to different areas of the design with the grid there as reference. Gridding also helps to make sure the design you want to stitch is going to fit on the fabric before you actually make any stitches. By gridding the fabric, you can make sure the design is centred and there is enough space around the edges for whatever it is you are going to be doing with the finished cross stitch. Gridding can also be useful if you want to stitch more than one design on the same piece of fabric. The gridding can help with the spacing and the alignment of the designs. Whether to use gridding or not is down to personal choice. There are lots of different ways that you can grid Aida fabric, and I'm going to share some. But the method that you choose to use if you want to grid your fabric is down to your personal choice. The first method of gridding is to use washable or heat erasable fabric pens to draw the grid onto your fabric. And depending on how good you are at following the holes on the fabric to keep the lines straight, you may also need a ruler when you're doing this method. With washable pens, the ink can be erased when you wash your finished project. It just washes out. And with a heat erasable pen, you can iron your finished project to make the lines disappear, or even just use a hairdryer on it. If you are going to use these pens, I would advise testing them on a bit of the fabric that is not going to be seen in your finished cross stitch, just to make sure that it agrees with the fabric and you can erase the lines afterwards. When drawing your grid, you could do continuous straight lines like this, or you could do dashed lines, or you could even just mark where the corners are of each of the 10 by 10 squares. This is just a personal choice as to what you want to work with. You can also choose where to start your gridding. So when I was gridding this piece of fabric, I started with my lines in the centre. I marked those on first and then drew all the other lines counting out from those centre lines. But you could start where you want the top left-hand corner of your stitching to start and draw the grid from there. Do need to ensure that you're going to have sufficient space around the design for however you're going to be finishing the project off. But this way could be particularly useful if you've got a larger piece of fabric that you know you're going to need to cut down, just to make sure that you have got enough space for the whole of the design before you even start stitching. Whilst using the pens to draw your lines on is a fairly quick and easy way to grid your fabric, I know some stitchers worry about the lines still showing afterwards, or even reappearing in the case of heat erasable pens, especially if the design they are stitching is not a full coverage piece. One way around this that I have seen some stitchers do is to work with the grid on the back of your work. So that's the back and you stitch on this side, which you can sort of see the grid through still. Might not on all fabrics, but you can on this one. But again, that's a personal choice. For some, it might be more practical to have the full grid facing them. An alternative to drawing your grid on is to sew the grid onto the fabric. And this can be helpful, particularly if you're using darker fabrics, as you've got more choice of the colours that you could use to draw it on. Because obviously if you're drawing on darker fabric with these pens, and most sort of fabric pens only really come in sort of blues or purples, you can't see that on the darker fabrics. If you decide to go for sewing your grid, you have a choice in what you can use to sew it with. You could use a single strand of embroidery thread in a contrasting colour to your fabric, and with embroidery threads there is a lot of colours available. However, embroidery thread could be easily pierced whilst you're doing your cross stitching, making it harder to remove this thread when you've finished your project. And to me, it's also a bit of a waste of precious embroidery thread that, let's face it, isn't cheap to buy. An alternative, and what I have used, is just ordinary sewing thread. However, it is still possible to pierce this when cross-stitching, especially if you're using a sharp needle. Some stitchers will use blending filament, which is a flat metallic thread, but that can be expensive as it is a speciality thread. A cheaper option used by some stitchers is monofilament fishing line, which comes in a variety of colours and can't be accidentally pierced when stitching. But some people may not like the plasticky texture, and the semi-transparent versions may be hard to see on darker fabrics. When stitching your grid lines, it is not necessary to secure the ends of your thread, but you can if you wish. And just like with gridding with pens, you can start with the centre lines, or you can start at the edge of where your design is going to be. Creating dashed lines with the thread is probably the easiest way to grid. So like I have done here, I have just done a line going across 3 squares at a time and missing 3 in between. You could do these dashed lines closer together or further apart if you wish. That's all down to personal preference. When doing this, I just cut a length of my sewing thread, the width or just over the width of the fabric that I'm going to be gridding. So I can just use one full piece for each line. Doing the dashed lines like this is probably the easiest way to do it, and also the way that will make it easily removable after you have finished your project. You could also make stitches in just the corners of the squares, in a similar way to how I've just marked the corners of the squares with the pen here. However, this may be more difficult to remove if the cross stitches are going over the threads, especially if these cross stitches are tight. It might just hold that thread in place and make it more difficult to remove when you finish your project. But again, it's all down to personal preference. If you don't want to grid your own fabric, you can purchase pre-gridded Aida, such as this. However, I have only seen it available in white Aida and mostly in 14 count, but I have seen it in 16 as well. As I said at the beginning, gridding your fabric is personal preference. I have never gridded my fabric, but I can see the benefit, particularly for full coverage designs with lots of colour changes and confetti stitches. If you have any questions about gridding or any tips from experience of gridding, please pop them in the comments. In the next quick cross stitch video, I will demonstrate ending with a buried thread.